The desert wind carried death on its breath that morning, whipping sand into spirals that danced like ghosts across the endless expanse of cracked earth and scattered sage. Marcus Kane pulled his hat lower against the stinging grit, his weathered hands steady on the reins despite the growing fury of the storm. 20 years of running from his past had taught him to read the signs written in cloud and wind, and this tempest spoke of violence yet to come. His horse, a sturdy bay mare named Ember, nickered uneasily as lightning split the bruised sky ahead. The air tasted of copper and rain that might never fall, and somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled like the echo of gunfire he'd tried so hard to forget. Marcus had been riding hard for 3 days, putting distance between himself and the town of Bitter Creek where his reputation had finally caught up with him again. The wanted posters never told the whole story. They spoke of banks robbed and men killed, but they said nothing of the hunger that had driven a 16-year-old boy to steal bread, or the corrupt sheriff who had beaten him senseless and left him for dead in an alley. They didn't mention the gang that had found him broken and offered him the only family he'd ever known, or how that family had twisted his desperate need to belong into something dark and unforgivable. Now, at 38, Marcus carried those sins like stones in his chest, each breath a reminder of the life he could never reclaim. The law wanted him, decent folk feared him, and God, if he existed at all, had surely turned his face away long ago. The desert was the only place left for men like him, where the sun bleached bones white and the wind scoured away all traces of who you used to be. The first drops of rain struck his face like tears he'd forgotten how to shed. Fat, warm drops that turned the dust to mud and filled the air with the smell of wet earth and possibility. Ember's ears pricked forward, and Marcus felt her muscles bunch beneath him as she caught sight of something ahead. Through the gray curtain of rain, a dark shape huddled against a boulder, small and still as death itself. Marcus reined in his horse, his hand instinctively moving to the colt at his hip. In his world, stillness usually meant an ambush, and trust was a luxury that had been beaten out of him years ago. But as the rain intensified and lightning illuminated the scene more clearly, he saw the truth that made his throat tighten with unexpected emotion. It was a woman, curled on her side like a sleeping child, her dark hair plastered to her skull by the downpour. Her dress, once probably a cheerful blue, was torn and stained with blood and dirt. She lay so motionless that Marcus was certain she was dead, another victim of the desert's indifferent cruelty. But something in the way her fingers clutched at the sand beneath her, as if trying to anchor herself to life itself, told him otherwise. He dismounted slowly, his boots silent on the rain-soaked ground. 20 years of violence had taught him to move like a shadow, but as he approached the woman, he found himself stepping carefully, almost reverently, as if entering a church he had no right to be in. She was young, maybe 25, with a face that would have been beautiful if not for the purpling bruise that covered half of it and the split lip that had bled down her chin. Her breathing was so shallow that Marcus had to lean close to hear it, a whisper of air that seemed to catch and stutter with each exhale. Her skin was pale beneath the sun-darkened complexion of someone who had spent her life outdoors, and when he touched her forehead, checking for fever, she was burning up despite the cooling rain. The smart thing would be to keep riding. The safe thing. Women meant complications, and complications meant the kind of attention that got men like him hanged from the nearest tree. But as thunder crashed overhead and the rain began to fall in earnest, Marcus found himself remembering another storm, another time, when he had been the one lying broken and forgotten while the world passed by. He had been 15 then, beaten unconscious by a storekeeper who had caught him stealing medicine for his sick mother. He'd awakened hours later in a ditch, rain filling his mouth and nose, certain he was going to die alone and unmourned. But an old Mexican woman had found him, had dragged him to her tiny adobe house and nursed him back to health with hands as gentle as his own mother's had been before the consumption took her. Isabella Ramirez had asked no questions about the blood on his clothes or the fear in his eyes. She had simply fed him beans and tortillas, sewn up the gash on his forehead, and told him stories of saints and miracles while the rain drummed on her roof. When he was strong enough to leave, she had pressed a small wooden cross into his palm and whispered a prayer in Spanish that he didn't understand but felt in his bones. He still carried that cross, worn smooth by years of handling, though he'd long since stopped believing in the God it represented. But standing over this broken woman in the desert rain, Marcus felt something stir in his chest that he'd thought was dead forever. Maybe it was memory, maybe it was guilt, or maybe it was just the recognition of one lost soul calling to another across the wasteland they both inhabited. Without allowing himself to think about the consequences, Marcus gathered the woman into his arms. She weighed almost nothing, as if the desert had already begun to claim her substance, leaving only the fragile shell of who she used to be. Her head lolled against his shoulder, and he could feel the fever burning through her wet clothes like a banked fire. Ember stood patiently as he lifted the woman across the saddle, her training overriding her natural skittishness. Marcus had bought the mare from a Mexican vaquero 3 years ago, and she had proven herself steady in situations that would have sent lesser horses into panic. Now she seemed to sense the gravity of their burden, standing rock-still as Marcus arranged the unconscious woman as comfortably as possible. The storm was worsening, turning the desert into a maze of flooding arroyos and treacherous mud. Marcus knew of a line shack about 5 miles north, abandoned by some long-dead rancher but still sound enough to provide shelter. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. The woman needed medical attention that he couldn't provide, but first she needed to survive the night. As they rode through the lashing rain, Marcus found himself studying the woman's face in the intermittent lightning flashes. Even unconscious and battered, there was something about her that spoke of strength held in check, of a spirit that refused to be completely broken despite whatever hell she'd endured. Her hands, though delicate, bore the calluses of hard work, and her worn dress suggested a life of modest means but fierce independence. The shack appeared through the storm like a mirage made solid, its weathered walls streaming with water but still standing against the wind's assault. Marcus had sheltered here before during his wanderings, and he'd taken the precaution of stocking it with basic supplies. It wasn't much, but it was dry and defensible, 2 qualities that mattered more than comfort in his line of work. He carried the woman inside and laid her gently on the single cot that occupied one corner of the small room. The air smelled of dust and abandonment, but it was warm and still after the chaos of the storm outside. Marcus lit the oil lamp with hands that shook slightly, whether from cold or something else, he couldn't say. In the lamp's golden glow, the woman's injuries looked even worse than they had in the rain. Someone had hurt her badly, and from the torn condition of her dress and the defensive wounds on her hands, Marcus could guess at the nature of the attack. His jaw tightened with a familiar rage, the same fury that had driven him to put a bullet between the eyes of the last man he'd caught forcing himself on a woman. But anger wouldn't help her now. Setting aside his own demons, Marcus began the careful work of assessment and care that Isabella Ramirez had taught him all those years ago. The woman's pulse was rapid but steady, her breathing shallow but regular. The fever was his biggest concern, along with a gash on her arm that would need cleaning and stitching. As he worked, cutting away the damaged portions of her dress to assess her injuries, Marcus found himself talking to her in the same gentle voice Isabella had used with him. He told her she was safe now, that no one would hurt her while he was there, that she just needed to hold on a little longer. He didn't know if she could hear him, but the words seemed to ease something in his own chest, as if speaking them aloud made them more true. The hours passed in a rhythm of care and vigilance. Marcus cleaned her wounds with whiskey from his saddlebags, the alcohol stinging his own hands where he'd scraped them on rocks while lifting her. He stitched the gash on her arm with the kind of precise attention he usually reserved for maintaining his weapons, knowing that infection in this heat could kill her as surely as any bullet. When the fever spiked near midnight, he stripped off his own shirt and used it to bathe her burning skin with cool water from his canteen. The intimacy of the act should have made him uncomfortable, but there was nothing improper in his touch, only the desperate efficiency of someone fighting death for a stranger's life. The rain continued its relentless drumming on the roof, each drop a percussion note in the symphony of the storm that had brought them together. Marcus found himself listening to that rhythm as he worked, his movements synchronized to the natural cadence of wind and water. There was something almost peaceful about it, this simple act of caring for another human being without thought of reward or recognition. He had forgotten what it felt like to tend to someone's needs instead of defending against their threats. For so many years, his hands had known only violence, his instincts honed for survival and retaliation. But now, as he gently sponged the fever from Sarah's burning skin, he remembered the profound satisfaction that came from healing instead of harming. Her breathing began to ease as the night wore on, the desperate rasp giving way to something deeper and more natural. The fever broke sometime around 3 in the morning, leaving her skin cool and damp with the sweat of crisis past. Marcus allowed himself a moment of relief, settling back in the rickety chair he'd pulled up beside her cot. In the lamplight, with the worst of her injuries cleaned and bandaged, Sarah Metcalf looked younger and more fragile than he'd first thought. Her face, though still marked by violence, held an innocence that the desert hadn't yet managed to steal. She slept with one hand curled beneath her cheek like a child, and Marcus found himself wondering what dreams visited her in those quiet hours before dawn. The storm outside was finally beginning to exhaust itself, the thunder growing more distant and the rain settling into a steady, gentle patter. Soon the sun would rise on a world washed clean, and with it would come decisions that Marcus wasn't ready to make. The woman would need food, proper medical attention, and eventually a safe place to go. None of these were things he could provide for long. But for now, in the space between night and morning, none of that mattered. What mattered was the steady rise and fall of her breathing, the peaceful expression that had replaced the mask of pain, and the strange sense of purpose that had settled over him like a mantle he'd never expected to wear. Sometime before dawn, as the storm finally exhausted itself against the desert floor, the woman stirred. Her eyelids fluttered like butterfly wings, and she made a small sound that might have been his name or might have been a prayer. Marcus leaned close, his own exhaustion forgotten in the face of this small miracle. "Easy," he whispered, his voice rougher than he'd intended. "You're safe. Just rest." Her eyes opened then, brown as river stones and filled with a fear so profound it made Marcus's chest ache. She tried to speak, but only a whisper of air emerged from her parched throat. He reached for his canteen, supporting her head as he helped her take small sips of water. "My name is Marcus," he said, the words feeling strange on his tongue. It had been so long since he'd introduced himself with his real name that he'd almost forgotten how it sounded. "I found you in the storm. You're hurt, but you're going to be all right." She stared at him with those dark eyes, and Marcus could see her trying to process what had happened, trying to reconcile his scarred hands and hard face with the gentleness of his touch. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper, but the words hit him like a physical blow. "Are you going to hurt me too?" The question hung in the air between them like smoke from a dying fire, and Marcus felt something break open inside his chest. Not the clean break of a bone snapping, but the slow, grinding fracture of ice giving way to spring. This woman, broken and bleeding and barely conscious, was afraid that he, her rescuer, might be just another predator in the endless succession of men who had failed to protect her. "No," he said, and the word came out like a vow he was making to himself as much as to her. "I won't hurt you. I give you my word." She studied his face for a long moment, and Marcus realized he was holding his breath, waiting for her verdict like a man standing trial for his life. Whatever she saw in his eyes must have satisfied her, because some of the terrible tension went out of her body, and she allowed her head to rest back against the pillow he'd fashioned from his bedroll. "What's your name?" he asked gently. "Sarah," she whispered. "Sarah Metcalf." The name fit her somehow, simple and strong and honest. Marcus filed it away in his memory like a treasure he'd found buried in the sand, something precious and unexpected that he would carry with him long after their paths diverged. "Well, Sarah Metcalf," he said, managing something that might have been a smile, "you're going to be just fine. But you need to rest now. Let your body heal." She nodded, her eyelids already growing heavy as exhaustion reclaimed her. But just before sleep took her again, she did something that would haunt Marcus's dreams for months to come. She reached out with one trembling hand and touched his wrist, her fingers barely making contact with his skin. "Thank you," she breathed, and then she was gone again, lost to the mercy of sleep. Marcus sat back on his heels, staring down at the spot where her fingers had touched him. The skin there felt branded, marked by a gratitude he'd never thought to earn. For 20 years, he'd been nothing but destruction walking on 2 legs, leaving a trail of pain and regret wherever he went. But in this moment, in this storm-lashed shack in the middle of nowhere, he had saved someone instead of destroying them. The realization should have filled him with satisfaction, but instead it opened up a hollow ache in his chest that felt bigger than the desert itself. Because for the first time since Isabella Ramirez had shown him kindness all those years ago, Marcus Kane was remembering what it felt like to be human. Outside, the storm's fury was finally spent, leaving behind the kind of profound silence that only comes after great violence has passed. The air smelled clean and new, washed free of dust and heat, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called out to the dying night. Soon the sun would rise on another day in the wasteland. But for now, in the space between darkness and dawn, a broken woman slept peacefully under the protection of a man who had forgotten he still had a soul to save. Marcus Kane settled back into the chair beside her cot, his hand resting near his gun but his eyes fixed on the gentle rise and fall of her breathing. Whatever had brought Sarah Metcalf to this place, whatever violence had left her broken in the desert, it was behind her now. He would make sure of that, even if it cost him everything he had left to lose. The lamp burned low as the hours passed, casting dancing shadows on the walls of their temporary sanctuary. And in that golden light, something began to change in the heart of the man they called an outlaw, something as quiet and inexorable as the turning of the seasons. The desert had always been a place of endings for Marcus Kane, where hope went to die and dreams were bleached white by the unforgiving sun. But as he watched over Sarah Metcalf in those quiet hours before dawn, he began to understand that sometimes the desert could be a place of beginnings too. The first pale light of morning crept through the single window of the line shack, painting everything in shades of gold and amber. Sarah slept on, her breathing deep, and even now, the crisis of the night behind her. Marcus remained at his vigil, this stranger who had stumbled into his world like a fallen star, burning bright against the darkness he'd carried for so long. He didn't know what the day would bring, what challenges they would face when she woke fully and they had to confront the reality of their situation. All he knew was that something fundamental had shifted in the space of a single night, something that couldn't be undone by distance or time or the weight of his sins. For the first time in 20 years, Marcus Kane was no longer running alone. The morning light grew stronger as the hours passed, transforming the harsh landscape outside their shelter into something almost beautiful. The storm had washed the world clean, leaving behind air so clear and sweet that it seemed to carry promises of redemption. Marcus watched through the window as the sun climbed higher, painting the distant mountains in shades of purple and gold that reminded him of the stained glass windows in the church his mother had taken him to as a child. Those memories felt like echoes from another man's life now, fragments of innocence that belonged to a boy who had believed in salvation and second chances. That boy had died in a dirty alley 23 years ago, beaten to death by a world that had no patience for weakness or want. But sitting here in this humble shelter, watching over a woman who had trusted him with her life, Marcus wondered if perhaps that boy's spirit had been sleeping rather than dead, waiting for the right moment to stir back to life. Sarah's color was returning as the morning progressed, the deathly pallor giving way to something more natural and healthy. Her lips, though still split and swollen, had lost the blue tinge that had frightened him so badly in those first desperate hours. She stirred occasionally, making small sounds of distress that spoke of dreams he hoped would fade with time and healing. Marcus found himself studying her face with the kind of attention he usually reserved for reading tracts or watching for pursuit. There was something about her features that suggested a life lived with purpose, a woman who had known both joy and sorrow and had chosen to embrace them both with equal courage. The lines around her eyes spoke of laughter as much as worry, and even in sleep there was a set to her jaw that suggested she was not easily broken. He wondered about her story, about the chain of events that had led her to that desolate place where he'd found her. The desert was not a place where decent women traveled alone, and the nature of her injuries suggested she had been fleeing from something or someone terrible. Marcus had seen enough violence in his life to recognize the particular brutality that came from men who enjoyed inflicting pain, and the thought of what she might have endured made his hands clench into fists. But anger would not heal her wounds or erase her memories. What she needed now was safety and time, two things that Marcus could provide even if he could offer little else. The irony was not lost on him that a man whom society had branded a criminal might be the very person best equipped to protect her from the kind of men who had hurt her. There was a certain rough justice in that, a balance that appealed to his sense of how the world ought to work. As the sun reached its zenith, Sarah began to stir more frequently, her sleep becoming lighter and more restless. Marcus found himself holding his breath each time her eyelids fluttered, wondering if this would be the moment she truly awakened and they would have to face the complicated reality of their situation. Part of him dreaded that awakening, knowing that with consciousness would come fear and questions he wasn't sure he could answer. What could he tell her about himself that wouldn't send her fleeing back into the desert? How could he explain that the man caring for her was wanted in 3 territories for crimes that ranged from robbery to murder? The truth would terrify her, but lies had a way of revealing themselves at the worst possible moments. Marcus had learned that lesson the hard way more times than he cared to remember. The afternoon brought a heat that seemed to rise from the very bones of the earth, turning the air inside the shack thick and heavy despite the shade. Marcus rationed their water carefully, using just enough to keep Sarah's fever from returning while saving the rest for drinking. He had filled his canteens from a small spring about a mile from the shack, but that supply wouldn't last forever, and he knew they would need to make decisions soon about where to go and what to do next. The smart thing would be to take her to the nearest town once she was strong enough to travel. Perdition was only about 20 miles south, a small settlement that boasted a doctor and a sheriff who might be able to help her find safe passage to wherever she had been trying to go. But Perdition was also the kind of place where Marcus Kane's face would be recognized, where wanted posters had a way of finding their way onto every wall and fence post. He could leave her at the edge of town, he supposed, with enough money to see her safely on her way. It would be the practical thing to do, the safe thing for both of them. But the thought of abandoning her to the uncertain mercy of strangers made something twist in his gut like a knife blade. She had looked at him with such trust when she'd whispered her thanks, had reached out to touch him as if he were something precious rather than something to be feared. When had anyone last looked at him that way? When had he last been seen as a protector rather than a threat? The realization that he couldn't remember made him feel older than his 38 years, worn down by the weight of a reputation that had become both his shield and his prison. The afternoon shadows were beginning to lengthen when Sarah's eyes opened for the second time, clearer now and more focused than they had been in the pre-dawn darkness. She blinked slowly, her gaze moving around the small room as if trying to piece together where she was and how she had come to be there. When her eyes found Marcus sitting beside her cot, she didn't flinch or cry out, but he could see the wariness that crept into her expression like a wild animal scenting danger. "How are you feeling?" he asked softly, keeping his voice gentle and his hands visible. He had learned long ago that sudden movements and harsh voices could send injured people into panic, and the last thing he wanted was to undo the fragile trust they had begun to build. "Thirsty," she whispered, her voice still rough from the trauma she had endured. "And sore. Everything hurts." Marcus reached for the canteen and helped her sit up enough to drink, supporting her with one arm while she took careful sips. She was stronger than she had been during the night, able to hold her head up and swallow without difficulty, but he could feel the tremor in her muscles that spoke of a body pushed beyond its limits. "You were in bad shape when I found you," he said, settling her back against the pillow once she had drunk her fill. "You've been unconscious for almost a full day. Do you remember what happened?" The question brought a shadow across her face, and Marcus saw her hands clench into fists beneath the blanket he had covered her with. For a moment, He thought she might retreat back into the protective darkness of sleep rather than face whatever memories his words had stirred. But Sarah Metcalf proved to be made of sterner stuff than her fragile appearance suggested. "I remember running," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "It was dark, and I could hear them behind me. They had horses, and I was on foot, but I kept running anyway because I knew what would happen if they caught me." She paused, her breathing becoming shallow and rapid as the memories took hold. Marcus wanted to tell her to stop, to spare herself the pain of reliving whatever hell she had escaped, but he sensed that she needed to speak these words as much as he needed to hear them. "I thought I had gotten away," she continued, her eyes fixed on something only she could see. "I found a place to hide among the rocks and waited until I couldn't hear their voices any more. But when I tried to move, I realized I was hurt worse than I thought. There was blood, and I felt so dizzy I could barely stand." Marcus felt his jaw tighten as he listened, but he kept his expression neutral and encouraging. Whatever had happened to her, it was clear that she had shown remarkable courage and determination in her escape. Not many people, man or woman, would have had the strength to keep running when injured and pursued. "I don't remember much after that," Sarah admitted, her voice growing even softer. "I remember being cold, even though the sun was beating down on me. I remember thinking about my sister and wondering if I would ever see her again. And then there was the storm, and I thought it was going to be the end of everything." She turned her head to look at him directly then, and Marcus was struck again by the depth of strength he saw in her brown eyes. Here was a woman who had faced the worst that men could do to her and had survived, had fought her way through pain and terror to reach this moment of relative safety. "But you found me," she said simply. "In all that emptiness, you found me and brought me here. Why?" The question caught Marcus off guard, though he supposed he should have expected it. Why had he stopped? Why had he risked his own safety for a stranger? The honest answer was one he wasn't sure he understood himself, let alone could explain to her. "Because you needed help," he said finally, the words feeling inadequate even as he spoke them. "Because no one should die alone in the desert if there's someone around who can prevent it." Sarah studied his face with an intensity that made him uncomfortable, as if she were trying to read something written in the lines around his eyes and the scars on his hands. Marcus had the unsettling feeling that she was seeing more than he wanted to reveal, understanding things about him that he kept carefully hidden from the world. "You're not what I expected," she said at last, and there was something like wonder in her voice. "When I first saw you, I was so scared. You look like the kind of man my mother warned me about, hard and dangerous. But your hands were so gentle when you cared for me, and your voice was kind. I don't understand it." Marcus felt heat rise in his cheeks, embarrassed by her praise in a way that he couldn't quite explain. Compliments were rare in his world, and when they came, they were usually about his skill with a gun or his ability to stay one step ahead of the law. No one had ever called him gentle before, and the word felt foreign and precious at the same time. "Maybe your mother was right to warn you," he said, trying to inject some lightness into his tone. "Maybe you shouldn't trust strange men who find you in the desert." But Sarah shook her head, a small smile tugging at the corners of her mouth despite her split lip. "My mother also taught me to judge people by their actions, not their appearance. And your actions have been nothing but kind." The simple statement hit Marcus harder than any bullet ever had, piercing through defenses he had spent years building and settling somewhere deep in his chest where it glowed like a banked coal. When had anyone last seen kindness in his actions? When had he last seen it in himself? "Tell me about your sister," he said, partly to change the subject and partly because he genuinely wanted to know more about this remarkable woman who had stumbled into his life. "You mentioned her when you were remembering." Sarah's face lit up at the mention of her sister, the shadow of trauma giving way to something warmer and more hopeful. "Emma. She's 2 years younger than me, but she's always been the smart one. She went east to become a teacher, got herself a position at a school in Kansas. She's been trying to convince me to come join her there, says there's opportunities for women like us if we're willing to work for them." "And you were traveling to meet her when this happened?" Marcus guessed. Sarah's expression darkened again, and she looked away toward the window where the afternoon light was beginning to fade toward evening. "Not exactly. I was running away from something, and Kansas seemed like as good a place to run to as any. Emma doesn't know I'm coming. She doesn't know about any of this." Marcus could hear the pain and shame in her voice, and he felt a familiar anger stirring in his chest. Someone had hurt this woman badly enough to send her fleeing across the desert with nothing but the clothes on her back. Someone had made her feel like she needed to run away from her own life, had stolen her sense of safety and belonging in the world. "Do you want to tell me what you were running from?" he asked gently. Sometimes it helps to speak these things aloud, to share the burden with someone else. For a moment, he thought she might refuse, might retreat back into the protective silence that trauma survivors often wrapped around themselves like armor. But Sarah had already shown him that she was braver than most, and after a long pause, she began to speak in a voice so quiet he had to lean forward to hear her. "I was married," Sarah began, her voice barely above a whisper, each word seeming to cost her something precious, "to a man named Thomas Baldwin. He owned the largest ranch in our county, had more cattle and land than any 3 men needed. Everyone said I was lucky to catch his attention, that a poor farmer's daughter like me should be grateful for such a match." Marcus remained perfectly still, sensing that any movement or sound might break the fragile thread of trust that was allowing her to speak these painful truths. The evening light was fading outside, casting the small room in shades of amber and shadow that seemed to cocoon them in intimacy and safety. "At first, he was everything a woman could want in a husband," Sarah continued, her eyes fixed on her hands where they lay folded on the blanket. "Charming, generous, attentive. He brought me gifts and flowers, took me to dances and church socials. He made me feel beautiful and important, like I was someone special instead of just another poor girl with no prospects." The way she spoke of those early days, with a mixture of wistfulness and bitter knowledge, told Marcus that the fairy tale hadn't lasted long. He had seen enough of the world to know that men who needed to make grand gestures to win a woman's affection were often the same men who felt entitled to control her once they had it. "The change started slowly," Sarah said, her voice growing even quieter. "Little criticisms about my cooking, my clothes, the way I spoke to his friends. He said he was trying to help me become the kind of wife a man in his position deserved. I thought he was right, that I needed to learn how to fit into his world." Marcus felt his jaw clench as he listened, recognizing the pattern he had seen too many times before. Men like Thomas Baldwin were predators in expensive clothes, using their wealth and position to isolate and control the women unfortunate enough to fall into their snares. The fact that society often applauded such matches, seeing them as advantageous for the woman, only made the trap more effective. "Then came the first time he hit me," Sarah whispered, and Marcus saw her flinch as if the memory itself carried physical pain. "I had burned the roast for Sunday dinner, and his business partners were coming to eat with us. He said I had embarrassed him, made him look like he couldn't even control his own wife. Afterward, he cried and begged my forgiveness, promised it would never happen again." The pattern was as old as time itself, and Marcus had to resist the urge to interrupt with curses against the man who had hurt her. Instead, he reached out slowly and covered her folded hands with one of his own, offering what comfort he could through simple human contact. Sarah looked up at him with surprise, as if she had forgotten he was there, so lost had she become in the dark memories. "But it did happen again," she continued, drawing strength from his touch. "Again and again, until I stopped believing his apologies and started fearing the sound of his footsteps in the hallway. He was careful, always hitting me where the bruises wouldn't show, making sure I could still appear in public as the perfect rancher's wife." Marcus squeezed her hands gently, his own scarred fingers rough against her soft skin. He wanted to tell her that she was safe now, that no one would ever hurt her like that again, but he knew that such promises were easy to make and harder to keep. Instead, he simply held her hands and let his presence speak the words he couldn't say. "I might have stayed forever if it hadn't been for what happened 3 weeks ago," Sarah said, her voice growing stronger as she approached the end of her story. Thomas had been drinking with some of his friends, celebrating a cattle deal that had gone well. I had learned to stay out of sight when he was in such moods, but he came looking for me anyway. She paused, taking a shaky breath before continuing. He had decided it was time for me to fulfill what he called my wifely duties in front of his friends. When I refused, when I told him I wouldn't be used like that, he lost control completely. He beat me worse than he ever had before, and then he left me on the floor while he and his friends continued drinking and laughing in the next room. Marcus felt a cold rage building in his chest, the kind of fury that had driven him to acts of violence in the past. The thought of this gentle woman being subjected to such degradation and brutality made him want to hunt down Thomas Baldwin and show him exactly what real violence looked like. But he forced himself to remain calm, to focus on Sarah's needs rather than his own desire for vengeance. That night, while he was passed out drunk, I took what little money I could find and ran, Sarah finished. I knew he would come after me, knew he would never let me go without a fight. So I headed for the desert, hoping to lose them in the wasteland where his money and influence couldn't reach. "But they followed you anyway," Marcus said, his voice rough with suppressed emotion. Sarah nodded, tears finally spilling down her cheeks. "They caught up to me 2 days ago. 3 of his men, led by his foreman, a man named Jack Morrison who enjoyed Thomas's work almost as much as Thomas did. They said they were going to take me back home, but first they were going to teach me a lesson about running away from my husband." Marcus closed his eyes, not wanting to imagine what that lesson had entailed, but understanding now how Sarah had come to be broken and bleeding in the desert. The fact that she had survived at all, had found the strength to escape again, spoke to a core of steel that ran through her like a hidden spine. "I got away during the night while they were sleeping," Sarah whispered. "But not before they had made it clear what would happen to me when they dragged me back to Thomas. So I ran again, even though I was hurt and had no water, because dying in the desert seemed better than living as their plaything." The silence that followed her words was heavy with the weight of shared understanding. Marcus had seen enough cruelty in his life to know that Sarah's story was not unique, that there were countless women trapped in similar hells all across the frontier. But knowing that didn't make her individual suffering any less real or any less deserving of justice. "They'll keep looking for you," Marcus said finally, his voice gentle but realistic. "Men like that don't give up easily, especially when their pride has been wounded." Sarah's hands tightened under his, and he could see the fear creeping back into her eyes. "I know. That's why I can't stay here, can't put you in danger because of my problems. You've done more than enough already, more than I had any right to expect from a stranger." But Marcus shook his head, his decision crystallizing even as she spoke. "You're not going anywhere until you're strong enough to travel safely. And when you do go, it won't be alone." "You don't understand," Sarah protested. "These aren't ordinary ranch hands. Thomas has money and connections, and he's not above hiring killers if that's what it takes to get me back. I won't have your blood on my hands because you tried to help me." Marcus almost smiled at that, though there was no humor in the expression. "Lady, I've been running from killers and lawmen for most of my adult life. A few hired guns from a cattle ranch don't scare me." The truth was more complicated than that, of course. Marcus Kane was indeed a dangerous man, but he was also outnumbered and far from any allies or safe havens. Taking on Thomas Baldwin's men would be risky at best, suicidal at worst. But as he looked into Sarah's frightened eyes, he found that the risk didn't matter. For the first time in 20 years, he had found something worth fighting for besides his own survival. "Why?" Sarah asked, echoing her earlier question, but with a different emphasis now. "Why would you risk your life for someone you barely know?" It was a fair question, and one that Marcus wasn't sure he could answer completely. Part of it was simple decency, the recognition that some things were worth fighting for regardless of the cost. Part of it was anger at the injustice of Sarah's situation, the familiar rage he felt whenever he encountered those who used their power to crush the innocent. But there was something else, something deeper and more personal that he was only beginning to understand. "Because 23 years ago, someone did the same for me," he said finally. "I was beaten half to death and left to die, just like you were. A woman named Isabella found me and nursed me back to health, asked for nothing in return except that I remember what kindness looked like." Marcus pulled his hands away from Sarah's and reached into his shirt pocket, withdrawing the small wooden cross that he had carried for all these years. The wood was smooth and dark with age, worn by countless handling, and as he held it up to the lamplight, he could almost hear Isabella's voice whispering those Spanish prayers he had never understood. "She gave this to me when I was well enough to leave," he continued, his voice thick with memory. "Told me that God had plans for me, even if I couldn't see them yet. I stopped believing in God a long time ago, but I never stopped believing in the power of one person to make a difference in another's life." Sarah reached out tentatively and touched the cross with one finger, her eyes wide with something that might have been awe. "You've carried this all these years?" "Every day," Marcus confirmed. "Through every robbery, every gunfight, every night spent sleeping in the dirt with one eye open. It reminds me that there was a time when someone saw something worth saving in me, even when I couldn't see it myself." The implications of his words hung in the air between them, the admission that he was indeed the kind of man she should fear, the kind whose picture graced wanted posters in sheriff's offices across the territory. But Sarah didn't pull away or cry out in alarm. Instead, she looked at him with those steady brown eyes and asked the question he had been dreading. "What's your real name? Your full name?" Marcus hesitated, knowing that once he spoke the words, there would be no going back. Sarah would know exactly who and what he was, would understand the magnitude of the risk she was taking by accepting his protection. But she had been honest with him about her own dark secrets, had trusted him with the truth of her pain and fear. He owed her the same honesty, whatever the consequences might be. "Marcus Kane," he said simply. "You might have seen the name on wanted posters. There's a $500 bounty on my head, dead or alive." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, processing this information and all that it meant. Marcus watched her face, trying to gauge her reaction, preparing himself for the fear and revulsion that would surely come. No decent woman wanted to be associated with an outlaw, no matter how desperate her circumstances might be. But Sarah Metcalf continued to surprise him. Instead of recoiling in horror, she studied his face with the same intensity she had shown before, as if she were trying to reconcile the notorious criminal with the gentle man who had saved her life. "What did you do?" she asked finally. "To get such a price on your head?" Marcus could have lied, could have painted himself as a victim of circumstance forced into a life of crime by cruel fate. But Sarah deserved better than comfortable fiction, especially after the courage she had shown in telling him her own truth. "I've robbed banks and stagecoaches," he said bluntly. "Stolen cattle and horses. I've killed men who were trying to kill me, and a few who were trying to hurt people who couldn't defend themselves. I'm not a good man, Sarah, no matter what kindness I might have shown you." "But you saved my life," she said softly. "When you could have just ridden past and avoided all this trouble, you stopped and helped someone who meant nothing to you. That has to count for something." Marcus felt that familiar ache in his chest, the sense that this woman was seeing something in him that he wasn't sure truly existed. One act of decency doesn't erase 20 years of crime. "Maybe not," Sarah agreed. "But it proves that the man who committed those crimes isn't the only man you can be. People change, Marcus. They grow and learn and choose to be better than they were." The hope in her voice was almost painful to hear, so bright and clean that it made him feel like a man emerging from a cave into sunlight. Marcus had spent so many years defining himself by his worst moments, by the violence and desperation that had driven him down this dark path. The possibility that he might be something more than the sum of his sins was both terrifying and wonderful. "Even if that's true," he said carefully, "it doesn't change the fact that helping you puts us both in danger. Thomas Baldwin's men are one thing, but there are lawmen and bounty hunters who would love nothing more than to collect the reward on my head. Being around me makes you a target." Sarah reached out and took his hand again, her touch warm and steady despite everything she had endured. "Then we'll have to be careful. Both of us have reasons to avoid certain kinds of attention, and maybe that means we're better off together than apart." The simple logic of her statement struck Marcus like a revelation. She was right, of course. They were both running from violent men who wanted to hurt them, both in need of protection and companionship in a world that had shown them little kindness. Perhaps their shared danger could become shared strength, their individual vulnerability transformed into mutual support. "Where would we go?" he asked, surprised to find himself seriously considering her suggestion. "Your sister in Kansas?" Sarah nodded eagerly. "Emma would help us. I know she would. She's always been the practical one, and she understands what it's like to be judged for things beyond your control. We could start over there, both of us. You could be anyone you wanted to be." The vision she painted was seductive in its simplicity. A new name, a new life, a chance to be the kind of man who deserved a woman like Sarah Metcalf. But Marcus had been running for too long to believe that escape was ever truly possible. The past had a way of catching up with you no matter how far you ran or how deeply you tried to bury it. "It's not that easy," he said gently. "Men like me don't get to just start over. The things I've done, the enemies I've made, they follow you wherever you go." "Then maybe it's time to stop running," Sarah said with quiet conviction. "Maybe it's time to stand and fight for something worth having." The courage in her voice took his breath away. Here was a woman who had every reason to fear violence, who had been brutalized and terrorized by the men in her life, and yet she was talking about standing and fighting rather than running and hiding. Her strength humbled him and inspired him in equal measure. As if summoned by their conversation about danger, the sound of hoofbeats reached them through the evening air. Marcus was on his feet instantly, his hand moving to his gun with the instinctive speed of a man who had survived by being faster than his enemies. Sarah's face went pale, and he could see the terror flooding back into her eyes. "Stay quiet," Marcus whispered, moving to the window and peering out through a gap in the weathered boards. "Don't move unless I tell you to." 3 riders were approaching the shack at a steady pace, their silhouettes dark against the purple sky. Even from a distance, Marcus could see that they rode with the purposeful confidence of men who were hunting rather than simply traveling. One of them, a large man on a paint horse, matched the description Sarah had given of Jack Morrison. Marcus felt the familiar calm descend over him, the cold clarity that came when violence was imminent and unavoidable. He had faced longer odds before and survived, but never with someone else's life depending on his skill and judgment. The added responsibility should have made him nervous, but instead it seemed to sharpen his focus to a razor's edge. "Is it them?" Sarah whispered, though she already knew the answer from his expression. "3 men, just like you said," Marcus confirmed quietly. "They've tracked us this far, which means they're better at this than I gave them credit for." He moved away from the window and began checking his weapons with practiced efficiency. His Colt was clean and loaded, his rifle ready and within easy reach. He had enough ammunition for a sustained fight, but not enough to waste on warning shots or intimidation. "What do we do?" Sarah asked, struggling to sit up despite her injuries. "We do what people like us have always done," Marcus said, his voice calm and steady despite the gravity of their situation. "We survive." The 3 riders approached with the casual confidence of men who had never met serious resistance, their horses picking their way carefully across the rocky ground toward the line shack. Marcus could hear them talking among themselves, their voices carrying clearly in the still evening air, though he couldn't make out the words. Whatever they were saying, there was laughter mixed in with it, the kind of cruel amusement that came from anticipating easy prey. Marcus positioned himself beside the window where he could see them clearly while remaining hidden from their view. The leader, the man Sarah had identified as Jack Morrison, was indeed large and imposing, with a kind of thick build that came from years of hard physical labor. He rode with his hat pushed back on his head, revealing a face that was all sharp angles and cruel lines, marked by a scar that ran from his left ear to the corner of his mouth. The other two men were cut from similar cloth, lean and weathered with the predatory alertness of men who lived by violence. One carried a rifle across his saddle horn with the easy familiarity of someone who knew how to use it, while the other had his hand resting casually on the butt of his pistol. They were dangerous. Marcus could see that immediately, but they were also overconfident. They expected to find a defenseless woman and perhaps an unarmed Good Samaritan, not a man who had learned to fight for his life in situations just like this one. "I can see tracks leading right up to the door," Morrison called out to his companions, his voice rough with tobacco and whiskey. "Looks like our little bird found herself a nest." "Think she's still alive?" one of the others asked, and Marcus could hear the disappointment in his voice, as if he were hoping the answer would be no. "She better be," Morrison growled. Mr. Baldwin was very specific about wanting her brought back breathing. Said he had some lessons to teach her about the consequences of running away from her husband. Marcus felt that cold rage building in his chest again, but he forced it down into the controlled fury that had kept him alive through countless gunfights. Emotion could get you killed in a situation like this. What mattered now was staying calm, thinking clearly, and making every shot count. "Sarah," he whispered without turning away from the window, "can you move? Can you get to the back corner where that old trunk is?" He heard the rustle of blankets as she struggled to comply, biting back what must have been considerable pain from her injuries. "I'm moving," she whispered back, her voice tight but determined. The riders had stopped about 30 yards from the shack, close enough to rush the door but far enough away to make accurate shooting difficult in the fading light. Morrison dismounted and handed his reins to one of his men, then began walking toward the shack with his hand on his gun. He moved with the swagger of a man who had never encountered serious opposition, his steps deliberate and unhurried. "Hello in there," Morrison called out, his voice taking on a mocking friendliness that made Marcus's skin crawl. "We're looking for a young lady, name of Sarah Baldwin. Pretty little thing, brown hair, might be hurt. You seen anyone like that around here?" Marcus remained silent, watching as Morrison continued his approach. The man was trying to draw him out, to get him to reveal his position and intentions before committing to a course of action. It was a basic tactic, but an effective one against most people. Unfortunately for Morrison, Marcus Kane was not most people. "Now I know someone's in there," Morrison continued, stopping about 10 feet from the door. "I can see the lamplight through the cracks, and those horse tracks outside are fresh. No point in playing games. We just want to talk to the lady, make sure she's all right." The lie was so blatant it was almost insulting. Marcus could see the anticipation in Morrison's posture, the way his hand had moved closer to his gun, the way his weight had shifted to the balls of his feet in preparation for sudden movement. This was a man who enjoyed inflicting pain, who took pleasure in the fear and helplessness of his victims. "Tell you what," Morrison said, his voice hardening as he abandoned the pretense of friendliness. "We're going to count to 10, and then we're coming in whether you invite us or not. Things will go a lot easier for everyone if you just open that door and let us do what we came to do." Marcus made his decision. Waiting for them to make the first move would give them the initiative, and in a fight like this, initiative was everything. Better to act while they still thought they held all the advantages, while they were still bunched together and overconfident. He eased the rifle to his shoulder and sighted carefully on Morrison's chest. The range was reasonable, The light was still adequate, and his target was standing perfectly still. It should have been an easy shot, but Marcus found himself hesitating, his finger frozen on the trigger as an unexpected thought crossed his mind. Killing these men would solve the immediate problem, but it would also confirm every terrible thing that had ever been said about him. In Sarah's eyes, he would become exactly what the wanted posters claimed he was, a cold-blooded killer who solved his problems with violence. The thought of seeing fear replace trust in those warm brown eyes was almost unbearable. But then Morrison began walking toward the door again, and Marcus remembered what these men had done to Sarah, what they planned to do to her if they succeeded in taking her back. Some choices were no choices at all, and some evils demanded a violent response regardless of the cost to one's soul. Marcus squeezed the trigger. The rifle's roar shattered the evening silence, and Morrison spun around as the bullet took him high in the shoulder, spinning him like a child's top before dumping him face first in the dirt. The other two men reacted with the speed of experienced fighters, diving from their horses and scrambling for cover behind the scattered rocks that dotted the landscape around the shack. "Son of a bitch!" one of them shouted, his voice high with shock and pain as a ricochet from Marcus's second shot sent stone chips flying into his face. "He's got a rifle." "Morrison," the other man called out. "You hit bad." Morrison was writhing on the ground, clutching his wounded shoulder and cursing with a creativity that would have impressed a riverboat gambler. The bullet had shattered his collarbone and torn through the muscle of his shoulder, leaving him alive but effectively out of the fight. Blood was spreading across his shirt in a dark stain that looked black in the twilight. "Can't use my gun arm," Morrison gasped out between curses. "Get that bastard. Mr. Baldwin is paying us to bring back the woman, not to get shot up by some desert rat." Marcus had already moved to a different window, knowing that staying in one position too long would get him killed. The remaining two men were competent enough to flank him if he gave them the chance, and he couldn't afford to let them get close to the shack while Sarah was still inside. A muzzle flash from behind a cluster of rocks told him where one of his opponents had positioned himself, and Marcus sent 3 quick shots in that direction, more to keep the man pinned down than with any real hope of hitting him. The return fire came immediately, bullets splintering the wood around the window frame and filling the air with flying debris. "There's only one of them," the second man called out, his voice coming from somewhere off to Marcus's left. "We can take him if we coordinate this right." Marcus grimaced at the truth of that statement. He was outnumbered and fighting from a fixed position, while his enemies had mobility and could choose their angles of attack. His only advantages were the protection offered by the shack's walls and his superior experience in gunfights. If he could keep them at a distance and make every shot count, he might be able to even the odds. "Sarah," he called out softly, not taking his eyes off the rocks where he had seen the muzzle flash. "How are you doing back there?" "I'm fine," she replied, though he could hear the strain in her voice. "Just scared." "That's normal," Marcus said, ejecting the spent shells from his rifle and reloading with practiced speed. "Fear keeps you alive in situations like this. Just stay down and stay quiet." Another burst of gunfire erupted from outside, this time from 2 different positions as the surviving men tried to coordinate their attack. Bullets hammered into the walls of the shack, punching through the weathered wood and filling the air with dust and splinters. Marcus kept his head down and waited for the barrage to end, knowing that they were probably trying to distract him while one of them moved to a better position. When the shooting stopped, Marcus risked a quick look through the window and immediately spotted one of the men sprinting from rock to rock, trying to work his way around to the side of the shack. Marcus led him slightly and fired, the bullet striking the ground just inches from the running man's feet and sending him diving for cover behind a boulder. "Damn it, Charlie!" the man behind the rocks shouted. "I thought you said there was only one of them." "There is only one," Charlie yelled back, breathing hard from his sprint. "But he shoots like he's got eyes in the back of his head." Marcus allowed himself a grim smile at that. If they thought he was some kind of supernatural marksman, they might be more cautious about exposing themselves. Fear was a weapon he could use just as effectively as bullets, and right now he needed every advantage he could get. The light was fading rapidly now, the desert twilight settling over the landscape like a purple blanket. Soon it would be full dark, and that would change the nature of the fight considerably. Marcus had spent enough nights sleeping under the stars to move confidently in darkness, but he didn't know if the same could be said for Baldwin's men. If he could hold them off until full darkness fell, he might be able to turn the tables on them. But Morrison, despite his wound, was still thinking tactically. "Fire!" he called out to his men. "Burn them out." Marcus felt his blood turn to ice water as he understood what Morrison was suggesting. The shack was old and dry, and it would go up like tinder if they managed to get a fire started. With Sarah injured and barely mobile, they would be trapped inside while the building burned around them. A flaming branch arced through the air and landed on the roof with a shower of sparks. Marcus could hear it rolling across the wooden shingles, the flames licking at the dry wood and beginning to catch hold. Another fire arrow followed the first, this one landing near the door and immediately beginning to spread along the weathered boards of the wall. "We have to get out of here," Marcus said, his mind racing as he tried to calculate their options. The back wall of the shack faced away from where the men were positioned, but it would mean abandoning the protection of the building and exposing them both to gunfire as they fled. "I can't run," Sarah said, and he could hear the pain in her voice. "I can barely stand." "You should go. Save yourself while you still can." Marcus turned to look at her then, this remarkable woman who was suggesting he abandon her to save his own skin. Even now, with death closing in from all sides, she was more concerned about his safety than her own. The courage and selflessness she displayed shamed him and inspired him in equal measure. "That's not going to happen," Marcus said firmly. "We're leaving together, or we're not leaving at all." The flames were spreading across the roof now, filling the shack with smoke and the ominous crackling of burning wood. Soon the entire structure would be engulfed, and they would have no choice but to run into the open where Morrison's men would be waiting for them. Marcus moved to the back wall and used the butt of his rifle to knock out several of the loose boards, creating a hole large enough for them to escape through. The sound of splintering wood was loud in the confined space, but it was masked by the roar of the flames that were now consuming the front of the building. "When I say go, you move as fast as you can toward those rocks about 50 yards behind the shack," Marcus instructed, pointing through the hole he had created. "Don't look back, don't hesitate, just run. I'll be right behind you." Sarah struggled to her feet, wincing as her injuries protested the movement. But Marcus could see the determination in her eyes, the same strength that had carried her through her escape from Thomas Baldwin and across the desert to this moment. She was afraid, but she wasn't broken. "What about you?" she asked. "How do you know they won't just shoot us both as we run?" "Because they'll be too busy dealing with me," Marcus said, checking his pistol one final time. "I'm going to give them something else to think about." The plan that had formed in his mind was simple and desperate, the kind of all-or-nothing gamble that had kept him alive through 20 years of violence. He would create a distraction, draw their fire and attention long enough for Sarah to reach safety. After that, he would improvise based on whatever opportunities presented themselves. "Go," Marcus said, and Sarah squeezed through the hole in the wall and began limping as quickly as she could toward the distant rocks. Marcus counted to 3, giving her a head start, then burst through the front door of the burning shack with his pistol in his hand and a war cry on his lips. The sudden appearance of their quarry caught Morrison's men off guard, and their first shots went wide as Marcus sprinted toward the nearest cover, firing as he ran. His third shot caught Charlie in the leg, sending the man spinning to the ground with a scream of pain and rage. The other man, startled by the sudden reversal of their fortunes, exposed himself for a crucial second as he tried to track Marcus's movement. It was all the opening Marcus needed. The bullet took the man's center mass, punching through his chest and dropping him like a stone. He hit the ground hard and didn't move again, his rifle clattering away across the rocks as his nerveless fingers released their grip. That left only Morrison, wounded and angry and increasingly desperate as he realized that his easy prey had turned into a deadly predator. Marcus could see him struggling to draw his pistol with his offhand. His face twisted with pain and fury as he tried to bring his weapon to bear. "This ain't over," Morrison shouted, his voice raw with frustration. "Mr. Baldwin will send more men. He'll never stop looking for her." "Then he'll find the same thing you found," Marcus replied, his pistol trained steadily on Morrison's chest. "A man who won't let you hurt her." Morrison's face contorted with rage and desperation. "You don't know what you're getting into, stranger. Thomas Baldwin owns half this territory. He's got judges and sheriffs in his pocket, and more money than you can imagine. You think you can protect one little woman against all that?" "I'm willing to try," Marcus said simply. The truth of those words settled over him like a benediction, bringing with it a clarity and purpose he hadn't felt in years. For so long he had been running from his past, fleeing from the consequences of his choices and the weight of his sins. But standing here in the firelight with Sarah's safety depending on his actions, Marcus finally understood what Isabella Ramirez had been trying to tell him all those years ago. Everyone had a choice about who they wanted to be, regardless of who they had been before. The man who had robbed banks and killed for money was also the man who had stopped to help a dying woman in the desert. The outlaw with a price on his head was also the protector who would risk everything to keep an innocent person safe. Morrison made his choice in that moment, swinging his pistol up with his wounded arm despite the obvious agony the movement caused him. But Marcus had been expecting it, had seen the decision form in the other man's eyes before Morrison himself had fully committed to it. Marcus's shot took Morrison in the center of his chest, the impact driving him backward into the dirt where he lay still and silent under the burning sky. The echoes of the gunshot rolled away across the desert, leaving behind a silence so profound it seemed to press against Marcus's ears like a physical weight. The fight was over. Marcus holstered his pistol and walked carefully among the bodies, checking to make sure that none of Morrison's men were still alive and dangerous. Charlie was unconscious from blood loss but still breathing, his leg wound serious but not necessarily fatal if he received medical attention soon. The other man was dead, killed instantly by Marcus's bullet. Satisfied that the immediate threat had passed, Marcus turned his attention to finding Sarah. She had made it to the rocks he had pointed out, and he could see her huddled behind a boulder with her arms wrapped around her knees, watching him with wide eyes that reflected the flames from the burning shack. "It's over," Marcus called out to her as he approached. "They're not going to hurt you any more." Sarah struggled to her feet as he reached her, and for a moment they simply stood there looking at each other across the small distance that separated them. The air was filled with smoke and the smell of gunpowder, and somewhere in the distance a coyote howled at the rising moon. It should have been a moment of triumph, but Marcus felt only a deep weariness and the familiar weight of taking another human life. "Are you hurt?" Sarah asked, her eyes scanning him for signs of injury. Marcus shook his head, touched by her concern despite everything she had just witnessed. "I'm fine. What about you? Did the running make your injuries worse?" "I'll live," Sarah said simply, and there was something in her voice that told him she meant more than just her physical condition. They stood there in the flickering light of the burning building, two damaged people who had found each other in the vast loneliness of the desert. Marcus knew that killing Morrison and his men had only solved their immediate problem. Thomas Baldwin would indeed send more men, and the bounty on Marcus's own head would continue to attract attention from lawmen and bounty hunters. The road ahead would be dangerous and uncertain, filled with challenges that would test them both. But for the first time in 20 years, Marcus Kane was not facing those challenges alone. And as he looked into Sarah Metcalf's eyes and saw trust instead of fear, acceptance instead of judgment, he began to believe that perhaps redemption was possible for even the most unlikely of souls. "So what happens now?" Sarah asked, echoing the question that was weighing on both their minds. Marcus looked around at the aftermath of the gunfight, at the bodies of their enemies and the burning remains of their temporary shelter. Then he looked back at Sarah, this remarkable woman who had shown him what it meant to fight for something greater than mere survival. "Now we head for Kansas," he said, the words carrying the weight of a promise and the hope of a new beginning. "We find your sister, and we start over. Both of us." Sarah smiled then, the first truly joyful expression he had seen on her face since finding her in the storm. It transformed her completely, erasing the lines of pain and fear and revealing the beautiful, strong woman she had always been beneath the scars of her ordeal. "Together?" she asked, and the simple word held a world of possibility. "Together," Marcus confirmed, and as they walked away from the burning shack toward the horses Morrison's men had left behind, he felt the wooden cross in his pocket and whispered a prayer of gratitude to whatever forces had brought them to this moment. Behind them, the flames reached toward the star-filled sky like an offering, consuming the remnants of their old lives and lighting their way toward whatever future awaited them on the long road to Kansas.